10 years ago, a lot of you walked out of The Force Awakens and said, if I want to watch A New Hope, I'll just watch A New Hope. For a decade, people told you to stop complaining. You were right. Some of you are already composing the comment. Do you not get tired covering the same thing? Fair instinct, and one worth addressing directly before the evidence starts arriving. There is a specific difference between having an argument that hasn't been settled and reading the final score after the game is over. The argument started in December 2015, in parking lots and Reddit threads and disappointed Christmas morning conversations. The evidence spent 10 years arriving. A completed trilogy, a stalled theatrical slate, a franchise that spent most of the last decade trying to course correct from its own foundation, while announcing and quietly shelving film after film. The 10-year mark isn't a reason to rehash. It's the point at which enough distance has accumulated to read what actually happened. The Force Awakens wasn't a love letter to A New Hope. It was a scene-by-scene corporate photocopy. A New Hope processed through a Lucasfilm-branded machine and sold back to you at current prices. Every defense mounted in 2015 has since been dissolved by what the subsequent decade produced. That's the thesis. Now the receipts. Start with the blueprint, because the blueprint is prosecutorial by itself. In A New Hope, a young orphan lives on a desert planet, waiting for a life that hasn't arrived. A droid carrying critical secret intelligence lands on that planet after escaping an enemy attack, separated from the people who sent it. The orphan and the droid find each other. They leave the desert together, fall into the company of a cynical veteran who operates a beloved old freighter that looks held together by optimism and old parts. Visit an alien bar filled with strange creatures where they receive exposition and direction, and eventually travel toward a planet-destroying superweapon with a single structural vulnerability that can be exploited in a precise attack. A mentor figure dies on that superweapon, killed by the masked villain. The masked villain has a concealed family connection to the hero. The hero receives an iconic weapon, a lightsaber, passed down from the previous generation, as the confirmation of a destiny they initially resisted. In The Force Awakens, a young orphan lives on a desert planet, waiting for family who will never return. A droid carrying critical secret intelligence lands on that planet after escaping an enemy attack, separated from the man who sent it. The orphan and the droid find each other. They leave the desert together, fall into the company of a cynical veteran who operates a beloved old freighter that has been sitting on that same desert planet as though the plot arranged for it to be there. Visit an alien castle filled with strange creatures where they receive exposition and direction, and eventually travel toward a planet-destroying superweapon with a single structural vulnerability that can be exploited in a precise attack. A mentor figure dies on that superweapon, killed by the masked villain. The masked villain has a family connection to a legacy hero. The hero receives the same iconic lightsaber, not a new one, not a metaphorical one, the same physical object, the same hilt, as confirmation of a destiny she initially resisted. Read those back, word by word, adjust for gender pronouns and the names of planets, and you are reading the same paragraph twice. The parallels don't stop at the structural level. They go scene by scene, beat by beat, down into the granular mechanics of individual sequences. In A New Hope, R2-D2 carries the Death Star plans. Princess Leia places them inside him during the Tantive 4 attack, moments before her capture. R2 escapes in a pod, lands on Tatooine, and makes his way toward Luke Skywalker, the person connected, however loosely, to the mission's destination. Luke finds R2, cleans the droid, removes a restraining bolt, and they proceed together. In The Force Awakens, BB-8 carries a map fragment pointing to Luke Skywalker's location. Poe Dameron places it inside him during the First Order attack on a village on Jakku, moments before his capture. BB-8 escapes across the desert and makes his way toward Rey, who is connected, in ways the film does not yet explain, to the Force and to whatever destination the mission requires. Rey finds BB-8, cuts him loose from a net, straightens his antenna, and they proceed together. These aren't thematic parallels between similar films. These are the same scene, redressed. The alien bar, Mos Eisley Cantina in A New Hope, a dark, crowded room populated by species from across the galaxy, a place outside the law where deals are made and passage is arranged. The specific function of the scene is to introduce Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon as the mechanism that will carry the protagonists forward, while establishing that the world beyond Tatooine is large and strange and dangerous. Maz Kanata's castle on Takodana in The Force Awakens, a dark, crowded building populated by species from across the galaxy, a place outside the law where information is exchanged and alliances form. The specific function of the scene is to introduce the lightsaber as the mechanism that will carry the protagonist's arc forward, while establishing that the world beyond Jakku is large and strange and dangerous. Both scenes end with enemy forces arriving and destroying the peace. The Cantina works because it's the first glimpse of a larger universe in 1977. The Takodana Castle is the second glimpse of the same universe, staged for an audience that has already spent decades in it. Maz Kanata performs the exact dramatic function Obi-Wan Kenobi performs in A New Hope. She's Force-sensitive and ancient. She provides exposition about the Force to a young protagonist who doesn't yet understand what she's capable of. She presents the lightsaber as a call to the protagonist's destiny, and she explains in clear terms what the hero must do next. Swap Alec Guinness into Maz's scenes, and the checklist of deliverables is unchanged. Both characters occupy the wise older guide slot in the story's architecture, and both give the protagonist the same object, Anakin Skywalker's original lightsaber, as the moment of confirmation, the hero's resistance. Luke wants to leave Tatooine from the film's first act, staring at the twin sunset with a specific, named longing. But when Obi-Wan presents the mission, he hesitates. Circumstances, his aunt and uncle's deaths, make the decision for him. Rey insists on waiting for family on Jakku, long past any rational hope they'll return. But circumstances, the First Order's arrival, BB-8's need, make the decision for her. Neither character chooses the adventure. Both get dragged into it by the destruction of what they were waiting for. The infiltration sequence. In A New Hope, Han and Luke acquire stormtrooper armor and disguise themselves to penetrate the Death Star's detention block. They bluff their way past guards with a cover story involving a prisoner transfer. The plan goes wrong, improvisation follows, and they escape through chaos rather than planning. In The Force Awakens, Han and Finn penetrate Starkiller Base using a plan to disable the shields from inside the facility. The plan goes wrong in specific, plot-required ways, and the heroes end up improvising their way through a chaotic situation. The template, veteran plus hero plus plan, inside the superweapon, complications, escape, holds. The opening massacre. A New Hope opens with Darth Vader storming a starship corridor. His presence establishes the scale of the threat immediately. In The Force Awakens, the first substantive scene shows Kylo Ren arriving at a village on Jakku with First Order stormtroopers and commanding the execution of its inhabitants. Both opening sequences exist to deliver the same data point. The enemy is powerful, ruthless, and the odds facing our people are severe. Zachary Antel, a student at Syracuse University, cut a 4-minute video in early 2016, placing these shots side by side. He titled it, A New Awakening. AV Club ran it. Business Insider ran it. Film ran it. Within 6 weeks of the film's release, a single person with editing software and functioning eyes had assembled a viral shot comparison demonstrating structural replication at the level of camera angles and scene construction. Not just plot beats, but visual beats. No research grant required. No advanced degree in film theory. A competent viewer with time and software. Vox published its review on December 26, 2015, the week after release, before the critical consensus had time to calcify into factions. The reviewer noted that by that point, more or less everyone had acknowledged the film closely echoed A New Hope, then went further, writing that echoes was too mild a word for what was actually happening. That was the mainstream critical read before the ink on the first box office reports was dry. This wasn't a hot take that arrived later. It was the immediate, obvious, contemporaneous reaction from critics who were watching the film with fresh eyes. Then there is the Millennium Falcon. Han Solo calls it a piece of junk in A New Hope. Obi-Wan says he's never heard of it. Luke is visibly skeptical. The ship is worn and patched, and the audience understands the dynamic instinctively. Battered but beloved. Functional but undignified. A vehicle that has earned its scars. Ben Kenobi's dismissal and Luke's skepticism set up the audience's relationship with the ship as something that requires a leap of faith the Falcon consistently rewards. 38 years of that relationship have accumulated by the time The Force Awakens opens. When Rey spots the Falcon sitting on Jakku and calls it garbage, the film is engineering an emotional beat. The audience's recognition of a beloved object, filtered through a new character's ignorance, that depends entirely on what the audience carried into the theater from 3 prior films. When Rey and Han first discuss the ship's mechanics, she explains what she's done to improve its performance. "I bypassed the compressor," she tells him. He looks at her with something between surprise and respect. The moment lands warm. Every jewel of that warmth, though, is borrowed. It comes from Han's relationship with the Falcon across 3 prior films, from the music cue, from the visual familiarity of that cockpit layout. Strip away the Millennium Falcon, and that exchange is maintenance dialogue between 2 characters you've met 90 minutes ago. The line works not because of what The Force Awakens built, but because of what it inherited. We'll return to the compressor. Before the Disney verdict is sealed, there is an argument on the other side that deserves genuine attention. Some people in December 2015 weren't defending The Force Awakens. They were arguing that the franchise was already structurally damaged before Disney acquired it, and that blaming Disney while ignoring the decade of prequel backlash is selective prosecution. George Lucas created Star Wars in 1977. He wrote and directed A New Hope, guided The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi as a producer, and returned in May 1999 with Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, the first of 3 prequel films he wrote and directed himself. The critical and fan response was swift and brutal, and it was targeted at Lucas specifically. Jar Jar Binks became one of the most mocked characters in modern franchise history within weeks. Midi-chlorians, the biological mechanism for force sensitivity introduced in Phantom Menace, were read widely as Lucas fundamentally misunderstanding, or actively dismantling, the mythology that had made the original trilogy resonate. The romantic scenes between Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman in Attack of the Clones, specifically the dialogue about sand, entered the cultural vocabulary as shorthand for wooden, unconvincing screenwriting. Jake Lloyd was 9 years old when he played young Anakin Skywalker in Phantom Menace. The sustained personal abuse he received from the fan community in the years that followed was severe enough to affect his life measurably. The backlash to the prequels wasn't purely critical discourse. It had casualties. By the mid-2000s, Lucas had noticeably withdrawn from public engagement with his own fan base. When he sold Lucasfilm to Disney in October 2012 for approximately $4 billion, that erosion of his relationship with the audience was documented context. Multiple accounts described the prequel backlash as a contributing factor in his decision to sell. The argument that the IP was compromised before Disney touched it has real weight that shouldn't be dismissed quickly. This argument has gained more traction since roughly 2022, when prequel rehabilitation accelerated significantly in fan communities. The generation that grew up with episodes 1 through 3 took over substantial portions of online discourse, and the Obi-Wan versus Anakin duel on Mustafar became one of the most emotionally discussed lightsaber sequences in the saga's history. Community threads debating whether the original prequel backlash was unwarranted proliferated across Reddit and elsewhere. Ewan McGregor returned as Obi-Wan Kenobi in a Disney Plus series, and the response confirmed that whatever sins the prequels had committed, the emotional connection to those characters had survived. The prequels have coherent mythology, a complete political architecture tracing the Republic's fall, and a character arc for Anakin Skywalker that runs from 8 years old to Darth Vader's unmasking. They are flawed films. They are also, unmistakably, films. works with a direction and a vision the creator was willing to defend publicly at significant personal cost. So the George Blamers case, as presented, Lucas damaged the IP, Disney inherited the damage. Here is where it meets a specific documented fact. George Lucas prepared story treatments for episodes 7, 8, and 9 as part of the Disney acquisition negotiations. Disney formally declined to use those treatments for the sequel trilogy. This isn't in dispute. Multiple sources confirm it, and it was part of Lucas's own public conversation about his feelings in the months following TFA's release. In his Charlie Rose interview from late November 2015, Lucas stated that Disney had wanted to make what he called a retro movie. That phrase is his, on record, describing the Disney approach to the new film. Rolling Stone headlined its coverage, "George Lucas is not a fan of retro Star Wars approach." The Guardian ran, "George Lucas hits out at retro Star Wars, The Force Awakens." These are contemporaneous, mainstream news stories based on a recorded interview, not interpretations applied after the fact. In that same interview, describing what he felt he had handed over in the sale, Lucas said he had given his creation to the white slavers that takes these things. He apologized afterward, describing the phrase as a very inappropriate analogy. The apology didn't retract the feeling the comparison was built around. He was separately documented as saying that if he got involved in the new films, he'd just cause trouble, because Disney wasn't going to do what he wanted, and he no longer had the authority to enforce anything. Business Insider, reporting in 2019, noted that Lucas had felt betrayed when his story ideas were rejected. Here is the distinction the George Blamers argument can't bridge. Lucas made films in the early 2000s with a specific, unconventional, personal vision. Jar Jar Binks wasn't focus grouped into existence. Midi-chlorians weren't the product of a brand safety committee. The Sand dialogue wasn't written to protect a $4 billion acquisition from audience rejection. They were the choices of a man with a specific story he wanted to tell, who was willing to be publicly and expensively wrong about some of those choices. Some of them were failures. Many of them were. But they originated from something, a direction, a set of convictions about what Star Wars mythology was and what it should become. You can disagree with every one of those convictions and still recognize that they existed. Disney rejected Lucas's treatments, hired a director, and produced a film that a university student could demonstrate was a structural replica of the 1977 original, using 4 minutes of side-by-side footage. The prequels, whatever their failures, weren't trying to be A New Hope. The Force Awakens, whatever its intentions, ended up functionally identical to it. One is an artist failing while attempting something. The other is a corporation succeeding at replication and calling it a sequel. Those are different problems. Only one of them is what this script is about. Back to the helmet. Kylo Ren enters The Force Awakens in full mask and armor, his voice modulated into a register that is specifically, deliberately, Vader adjacent. This isn't a design accident. Academic analysis of the character documents that his helmet was constructed as an imitation of Darth Vader's. The film makes this explicit by showing Kylo speaking privately to the burned, melted remains of Vader's actual helmet in his quarters, asking it for strength, asking it to show him the power of the dark side. It's one of the most honest moments in the film because it's the text showing you its own operating manual. This is a character who has chosen to cosplay Darth Vader. Inside the fiction, yes. But simultaneously, the film has chosen to cosplay Darth Vader as its primary villain concept. The mask comes off multiple times across The Force Awakens. Once to interrogate Rey, once in the sequence leading to Han Solo's death. The helmet is removed often enough across the film's runtime that any pretense of it being essential to the character, the way Vader's mask was essential, a life support device, a permanent physical and symbolic condition, collapses. Each removal gives us Adam Driver, a genuinely talented actor, working with real material, producing a performance that is emotive, exposed, and specific. And therein lies the structural problem. Because the Vader-adjacent menace the mask projects, and the conflicted, emotionally raw young man Driver plays behind it, are pulling against each other in every scene where they coexist. There is a scene in The Force Awakens, in the theatrical cut, plainly visible, not a deleted scene or an extended edition, where Kylo Ren receives bad news and responds by igniting his lightsaber and destroying equipment in a small room. Stormtroopers passing in the corridor outside hear the sounds, stop, make brief eye contact with each other, and walk the other direction. Academic analysis describes Kylo as a kind of baby Darth Vader who throws tantrums. That isn't a critic inventing a characterization. It's a description derived from specific, visible behavior in the film the studio released. Darth Vader executed officers for incompetence without breaking his stride. He walked through corridors, and the fear preceded him by rooms. He didn't break equipment. His subordinates feared consequences that were real and immediate. There was no moment in A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, or Return of the Jedi where stormtroopers silently agreed to be somewhere else while Vader had a moment. The power was self-evident. The film never had to argue for it. The Force Awakens is arguing for Kylo Ren's menace in one scene, while simultaneously giving you the stormtrooper hallway walk in another, and hoping you don't notice the contradiction. The mask is the argument's primary tool. Invoke Darth Vader visually, and transfer some of that established menace to the new character before he's earned it. The stormtrooper scene is the contradiction's most legible expression. He hasn't earned it. Keep the mask in mind. It has work to do later. December 18th, 2015. Starkiller Base. A catwalk bridge over a vast interior drop. Han Solo walks out onto it. His son stands at the other end, helmet on, lightsaber unlit. Han calls him Ben. He says he knows there's conflict inside him, that they can go home, that he and Leia have never stopped thinking about him. The voice modulator makes Kylo Ren's reply sound enormous in that space. The helmet comes off. What remains is a young man's face, uncertain, pained, genuinely torn between two versions of himself. Han reaches toward him. Ben Solo seems, in this moment, to be deciding something real. Then Kylo drives his lightsaber through Han Solo's chest. Harrison Ford had been advocating for this moment since 1983. During the filming of Return of the Jedi, he pushed for Han Solo to die in the rebel assault on the second Death Star. His stated and documented reasoning, offered across multiple interviews spanning decades, was that Han's death would give the story significant emotional weight, that a character who had fully committed to something larger than himself deserved a meaningful ending, rather than a celebratory survival that left him with nowhere left to go as a character. George Lucas rejected the request. Han survived Jedi. The rebellion won, and Han was part of the victory. Ford finally got the scene. J.J. Abrams confirmed afterward that Kylo Ren in that moment had genuinely considered turning back to the light, that the killing was an internal battle fought and lost in real time, not a premeditated execution. Adam Driver and Harrison Ford do something real with those 2 minutes on the bridge. The scene is quiet, specific, and earned within its own immediate context. On a pure scene level, it functions. The problem is the architecture surrounding it. 4 decades of audience investment in Han Solo had built a relationship with that character that no single film could fairly discharge. His arc across A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, from self-interested mercenary to committed rebel to general, a man who kept choosing something larger than himself without ever fully making peace with who he'd been before, had run long enough to create one of the most durable human relationships between audience and screen character in modern cinema. The Force Awakens inherits that entire accumulated relationship and runs it as emotional fuel for a death that serves the new story's need for a traumatic event. The film invests 2 scenes in Han Solo before spending everything the previous 3 films deposited. Structurally, Han functions in The Force Awakens as the Obi-Wan Kenobi figure. He is the veteran mentor from the previous era who guides the younger protagonists, who provides them with transportation and credibility and knowledge of the world they've entered, and who dies on the superweapon at the hands of the masked villain while the hero watches from below. That slot in the story required a death. Han Solo was the available legacy character who fit it. Whatever Harrison Ford wanted for the character, however genuine that desire for a meaningful ending, the specific death the film delivered was determined in large part by the structural template TFA was working from. The parallel demanded it. A comment circulating in the weeks after the film's release put the feeling precisely. When they killed Han, the commenter wrote, they immediately knew it was the end for the franchise. The language, murdered, not killed, carries specific weight. Murder implies that something was taken that didn't need to be, that a different choice existed and was rejected. The instinct was pattern recognition. Watching a 40-year relationship get used as infrastructure for a borrowed story, and understanding in real time what that suggested about the films to come. The franchise didn't end that night, but the trust equation changed. The subsequent decade confirmed the instinct. Luke Skywalker appears in The Force Awakens for approximately 2 minutes, at the end of the film, with no spoken lines. He isn't a character in the story. He is the destination of a map. Every event in The Force Awakens, Poe's mission to retrieve the map fragment, BB-8's journey across Jakku, Rey and Finn's escape and alliance, Han and Leia's involvement, the entire attack on Starkiller Base, is organized around locating this map. Luke Skywalker is the MacGuffin. The protagonist of the original trilogy, the character whose journey provided the mythological and emotional spine of 3 films and an entire cultural mythology, is deployed as the object that motivates other characters without possessing intrinsic dramatic function of his own within the film's runtime. In the final scene, Rey climbs stone stairs on a remote island, reaches the top, and holds out Luke's lightsaber toward the man who owns it. He turns around. The frame cuts to black. He doesn't speak. The film that sold tickets on his name, his face, and 38 years of investment in his story gives him 0 lines. This might have been defensible setup, a sustained, deliberate withholding that would pay off in a film genuinely centered on Luke Skywalker. What followed was The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson's film, which built its story around a broken man in voluntary exile from his own mythology, who in a moment of fear and poor judgment had briefly held his lightsaber over the sleeping form of his nephew Ben Solo, ignited the blade for 1 second, and then stopped. Too late. Ben Solo saw the blade coming and became Kylo Ren in that instant. Luke's one terrible moment of cowardice was the event that unraveled everything. Mark Hamill, who had played Luke Skywalker across 4 decades, told Johnson directly that he fundamentally disagreed with every choice made for the character. He said this in public, explicitly. Within months, he was walking the statement back, eventually saying he regretted voicing those doubts publicly. He never said the doubts were wrong. His documented objection was substantive. The man who had refused to kill Darth Vader when the Emperor demanded it, who had trusted in his father's residual humanity at the cost of potential destruction, had reportedly reached for a blade over a sleeping student. Hamill understood that this required a Luke Skywalker who had been built toward that failure across multiple films. The Force Awakens hadn't built anything. It had found Luke on a map and used him for a final image. The deeper wound the Luke situation reveals is about the difference between a character and a brand asset. The Force Awakens used Luke Skywalker's name and face, and the 38-year emotional history attached to them to sell tickets, merchandise, and anticipation. His silhouette appeared in trailers. His name was in the opening crawl. The promise of Luke Skywalker was central to the marketing infrastructure of the film's release. What the film delivered in return for that promise was a 2-minute, wordless appearance and a cliffhanger. The sequel then used Luke Skywalker as raw material for a different film's philosophical argument about the dangers of hero worship, which might be interesting as a standalone work, but registers as a betrayal when the hero being deconstructed is one the audience was just asked to spend 2 films searching for. The fans who described this as Disney turning Luke into a quitter were working from emotion, but the emotion pointed at something accurate. The man who had trusted the Force enough to throw away his lightsaber in front of the Emperor, who had believed in his father when nobody else did, who had faced the ultimate test of his mythology and passed it. That man was now being written as someone who couldn't face his own student without briefly contemplating murder. The arc didn't fail because Luke was allowed to be flawed.
It failed because the flaw selected was specifically designed to negate his defining quality, without the preceding films doing the dramatic work that flaw required. J.J. Abrams knew what he'd made. The "it's just a New Hope" criticism arrived on opening weekend from mainstream critics, and he engaged with it. Slash Film ran his explanation under the headline, "J.J. Abrams explains why Star Wars: The Force Awakens borrows." Reddit documented his public address of the criticism in 2016. He gave an MTV interview discussing his choices. Within days of release, he was aware that the structural parallel had been identified, and he offered reasoning rather than denials. His public reasoning, assembled from the available record, amounted to this. The film was designed to feel like Star Wars at a moment when that phrase meant, specifically, the emotional texture and visual vocabulary of the original trilogy. Academic sources characterize The Force Awakens as the quintessential franchise nostalgia film of the 2000s, a film that built its identity around invoking an established feeling rather than creating a new one. Multiple sources confirm that TFA was explicitly constructed to avoid the prequel aesthetic. That decision, avoid the prequel aesthetic, is where the intent becomes legible, because it wasn't a neutral creative choice, it was a strategic one. Someone produced a design brief, whether formal or informal, that pointed away from episodes 1 through 3 and toward episodes 4 through 6. When you follow a design brief pointing away from the prequels and toward the originals, the film you produce looks like the originals. No executive memo with the words, "replicate A New Hope for brand safety," has entered the public record. What exists is the pattern, comprehensive enough to generate mainstream critical commentary on opening weekend and a viral shot comparison within 6 weeks, and the context in which the film was made. A $4 billion acquisition of a franchise whose most recent theatrical chapter had generated one of the most toxic audience reactions in modern film history. Disney paid $4 billion for something the audience had rejected. The incentive to not repeat that rejection was immense and obvious. The film that emerged from that incentive structure looks, beat by beat and scene by scene, like the version of Star Wars the audience had previously accepted. Call that strategic intent, or call it the inevitable output of a risk-averse production culture. The film is the same either way. And the film's relationship with its own borrowed material wasn't even concealed. "I bypassed the compressor," Rey tells Han, "and the moment lands warm, because the Millennium Falcon is there, because John Williams is there, because 38 years of accumulated feeling is sitting in the theater next to you." The line performs real emotional work. The work is being performed by your prior relationship with a ship you loved before this film existed. If the Falcon were called something else and had never appeared in another film, that line would be technobabble between two characters you've known for 90 minutes. The engineering of that warmth is precise and deliberate, and it's the engineering of borrowed feeling, not the creation of new feeling. The threads the film left dangling, the questions seeded in Act 1 and unresolved by Act 3, the things that went nowhere across the trilogy, aren't evidence of a director committed to sustained mystery. They are the residue, or at least appear to be, of a film built primarily to launch a franchise rather than complete a story. The engine was designed to pull sequels. The sequels pulled in different directions from each other. The franchise stalled. Here is what the 10 years after The Force Awakens produced. The first measurable signal came with Solo, a Star Wars story, in 2018. The film underperformed enough to register as data. Audiences who had returned in extraordinary numbers in December 2015 weren't prepared to show up unconditionally for every product stamped with the Star Wars name. Solo's domestic underperformance was discussed industry-wide as a signal that the goodwill TFA had generated wasn't an inexhaustible resource. The Rise of Skywalker, released in 2019, attempted to resolve a trilogy whose middle chapter had deliberately moved away from TFA's framework, while also functioning as a corrective to The Last Jedi's choices. It had to simultaneously be a conclusion to the three-film arc, a response to audience complaints about the previous film, and a coherent story on its own terms. It couldn't fully be any of those things simultaneously. The discourse around its release was exhausted in a way that the discourse around TFA had not been. Not the engaged, charged argument of fans who disagreed, but the flattened conversation of an audience that had run out of investment. Even its defenders found the conversation around it draining. The sequel trilogy concluded without establishing new mythology with the durability of the original. The Sith Eternal plot device replaced Snoke, who had replaced the Emperor, none of whom generated a single moment of the cultural permanence attached to "I am your father." The new central trio, Rey, Finn, Poe, never achieved the triangular dynamic of Luke, Han, and Leia, in part because the trilogy's three films sent them in directions that repeatedly separated them, rather than forging the relationship that dynamic requires. The ending resolved the plot without resolving the question of what the sequel trilogy had been for. Theatrical Star Wars projects continued to be announced and quietly shelved. The ambition of a new theatrical Star Wars film every 1 to 2 years, the Disney model deployed across the IP, didn't survive contact with audience indifference and critical skepticism. Disney Plus became the franchise's primary production pipeline, with television series of varying quality and reception. The theatrical slate that existed in announcement form by 2020 had been substantially dismantled by 2025 without producing films. None of this says The Force Awakens destroyed the franchise in a single evening. It demonstrably thrilled millions of people in December 2015. The nostalgia architecture functioned exactly as designed, the first time. The Falcon was there, the music was there, Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher were there, and for 2 hours, the original trilogy was effectively present in a new film. For many people in those theater seats that December, that was enough. That feeling was real. The record says something structural. A franchise built on replicated nostalgia has no forward direction, because the direction it points is backward. The Force Awakens was engineered to produce the feeling of watching a Star Wars film from the original trilogy. It succeeded at that once, in one film. The sequel trilogy, then, had to produce something new, using a foundation that wasn't designed to support new construction, because its design was a copy of something that already stood. Empire Strikes Back followed A New Hope without replicating it, and built something genuinely distinct from and consequent to its predecessor. The Force Awakens gave the sequel trilogy no equivalent to push against or grow from, because what it built was already a photocopy. You can't advance from a copy. You can only make more copies, or abandon the template. And when The Last Jedi abandoned the template, the audience that had returned for the copy blamed the abandonment. That argument started in parking lots in December 2015. The fans who made it were told to stop. Back to the helmet, its final scene. In The Last Jedi, Kylo Ren smashes his mask in an elevator. The fragments of the Vader cosplay helmet scatter across the floor, and the film frames this as a character development. Ben Solo discarding a borrowed identity, stepping towards something authentically his own. For stretches of the film, this works. Kylo without the mask is a more dynamic character, raw, more genuinely conflicted, pursuing a version of himself rather than an imitation of his grandfather. But the smashed helmet proves something the film didn't intend to prove. Kylo Ren without the mask is the same character as Kylo Ren wearing it. The instability is identical. The anger is identical. The hollowness at the center of his ambition, the absence of anything he has genuinely built as opposed to performed, is identical. The voice modulator is gone. Everything it was supposedly projecting remains unchanged underneath. The helmet was never doing dramatic work. It was doing visual work.
invoking Darth Vader for an audience that needed to recognize the shape of a Star Wars villain before the film had developed one from its own material. When the mask went, nothing was lost that the character had actually constructed, because the character had been constructed in the mask's image, not beneath it. Remove the Vader outline, and what remains is a conflicted young man whose conflict the film had not yet provided with a genuine object. Kylo Ren is the helmet argument made flesh, a copy of a more powerful original, compelling at first glance, increasingly hollow as the architecture beneath the visual is examined. The stormtroopers walking the other direction in that hallway understood this before the audience did. "I bypassed the compressor," Rey says, and Han looks at her with warmth and respect, and the audience feels something real. The Falcon is there. The music is right. 38 years of accumulated love for that ship and that man and that cockpit are present in the theater. It's a genuinely good moment. It's also a moment that the film borrowed completely, every component of it sourced from somewhere else, assembled with precision and care, and delivered to an audience that had brought the feelings from home. Peel away the borrowed feeling, and the line is maintenance dialogue. Peel away A New Hope, and The Force Awakens is a competently made film with nothing it could call its own. The fans who walked out in December 2015 and said, "If I want to watch A New Hope, I'll just watch A New Hope," weren't cynical. They weren't asking too much, or misunderstanding what sequels are allowed to do, or applying unfair standards to a corporate entertainment product. They were the audience this franchise had spent 4 decades earning, people who had grown up with these stories and carried them for years. And they could identify the difference between a story and a photocopy of one before the subsequent decade handed them the complete evidence. The subsequent decade handed them the complete evidence. You can't photocopy a spark. The 10 years that followed The Force Awakens demonstrated this with a thoroughness that no argument from December 2015 could have matched. The record is in. The verdict is what it was always going to be. Subscribe for more stories like this.